Hey everybody, it is Saturday evening and we are going to take a trip around the world. So we're going to start here with my 29 miscellaneous as usual. And this week I actually did a little bit of work on it. I did a big water change. I cleaned the filters, or I should say I just replaced the filter pads. And I removed a bunch of the floating water sprite. You can see how nice and open the tank is and it looks very brightly lit. Part of that brightly litness is the fact that I changed over the power supply to the LEDs that were on there. I think I had a bad switch or something from the original unit. Every time you turned it on, you see it would get really bright, and then if you touch the switch, it would get slightly dimmer, and eventually it just stopped working altogether. So instead of throwing the whole unit away, I just cut the power supply. I actually had a barrel connector. I didn't have to cut anything. I just found a power supply that had a barrel connector on it and hooked it up, and sure enough, I've got brand new beautiful LED light from the original set that was in there. And so I think the switch or the original power supply was very low quality, and that's why it looked as poor as it did. So I'm actually kind of glad it finally went out after all these years of looking at this tank. It looks great. It's more brightly lit now than ever, and I've had this tank for 7 or 8 years, so I'm really happy about that. My little Bolivian ram is in there somewhere. There he is over there in the corner. Still looking good. Being happy. I've had it in there long enough now that I'm not really worried about any kind of disease or parasite or anything. It's got a nice full looking belly. It eats. It acts normal. Its color's good. So I'm happy about that. I can't really think of too much else to talk about with this tank, so we've got a lot to cover this week. We'll just go ahead and move on to my... Oh, I just knocked something over behind me. Oh, okay, it was just a bit of fish food. I'm not worried about that. I have plants and stuff behind me, and I just thought I'd knock one of them over, but we'll get to that later as well. So this is my 55-gallon gourami tank. As you may or may not be able to tell, I just got done doing a great big water change on this, which is what inspired me to get in here and actually do this update, catch everybody up on what's been going on in here. Nothing too elaborate tonight. I did get in and wipe the front glass down thoroughly. I got it nice and clean. And the back glass I gave sort of a preliminary wipe and sort of rubbed a lot of the surface stuff off, but not entirely. So I do still have plenty of the hair algae growing in there, but with the live bears I've got in the tank now, they're just keeping on top of keeping it groomed and cropped down. And then of course I've got the off-wax grazers, the pleco, the rubber lip, and the Hillstream loaches in there, and so they usually do a pretty good job of keeping everything scoured and scraped clean. So this tank is sort of staying clean, sort of getting algae in it. I did check the nitrates in this tank while I was doing the water change just for the information, just to find out what was going on. I just like to see what's going on in my tanks from time to time, and checking the nitrates is a good, easy way to get an idea of some of the things that are going on in the tank. And I was really surprised to see that the nitrates were actually... I don't think the angelfish liked having all those bubbles all over it, so I was wondering why it was rubbing up against the branch like that. I thought it was trying to get the bubbles off of it, but it really just did a good job. It had bubbles all over its fins, and now it does not. So good job, angelfish. The nitrates were still, the vial was still yellow. I didn't match it up with anything because it didn't even bother to get like a tannish orange color. I won't say it had 0 nitrates, but it probably didn't get up to 10. So that was kind of a surprise for me. I'm not used to my fish tanks looking like that. I'm used to seeing red when I do a nitrate test on my fish tanks. So not much going on as far as that's concerned. There's my little Hillstream loach right there, one of the off-wax grazers in the tank. And I don't see the other one. My little chocolate gourami is back there. It's still doing well. Of course, my big catfish in here is still doing well, with the exception of it probably needs more room. But other than that, it's doing well. So we're going to move on from this tank, get to my 55-gallon T-bar tank, if I can avoid knocking into anything again. Not a ton going on in here. I did do a water change in this tank. I did a gravel vac superficial gravel vac. I didn't go really deep. This the substrate I use is sort of designed to settle in over time, especially if you've got plants in it. It's bimodal, meaning that it's got large pieces and more small, like sand-like pieces, and the sand sort of settles to the bottom and the larger stuff works its way to the top, and you wind up getting this sort of multi-layered substrate. So gravel vacuum, it's not the best of ideas with this type of substrate anyway, but you can get in there and do a sort of superficial gravel vac, which is what I did. I removed a lot of the dead leaves that were in there, and I removed a lot of the pleco poop that was in there, and you can see it all sort of swirls around and collects down at this end, and I've got that much in there again already. So that's the other thing that I've kind of got going on with this tank, is the idea that this pleco, and you can see its nose sticking out right there, and you can see its body back through there, and its tail goes all the way almost to the back glass. So it's really getting about time for this fish to get out of here, but I really like it. It's a really cool fish, and it keeps this tank so clean. If you can see that sort of brown coloration on the leaves, those leaves would be covered in brown if it wasn't for that pleco in there scraping the leaves clean. And those brown marks are just sort of the relief pattern. It's the depressions or the divots where it can't scrape clean, and it leaves the sort of brown diatom algae or that red algae or whatever that is. It looks sort of reddish down this end, and it looks more brownish up at this end. So whatever that is, it's being left behind by that pleco. So I'm wondering, if I take it out of this tank, what is going to happen to this tank. Even just shifting the bioload by removing this one large fish, just changing the balance in a tank like that, especially one that's been established for so long like this and so well balanced, making a big change like that can really shift a tank, and I can really start running into issues. Hence what's going on over here in my gourami tank. I don't know what I did, but I changed something, and I've had issues ever since. And I'm finally getting it back under control, but it's really going to probably change again when I do something else with that tank, but that's for another time. So the idea with this pleco is that it can probably wind up going in my 125, but I'm afraid of putting it in my 125 because I don't want to shift the balance in that tank, and I've got some plecos already that live on the bottom and have their little territory staked out, and then having another great big pleco put in the tank, to reestablish a new territory. And I'm just not sure I want to disrupt two tanks that dramatically. My other option is to just take it down to the fish store and trade it in for store credit, which I can easily do. So that's just something I'm thinking about, but it's going to need to happen fairly soon. My 40 breeder here is what I'm calling it now. This is formerly my black ghost knifefish tank. If you were unaware, I lost my black ghost knifefish in this tank due to user error. Still not really over it, I guess. I haven't really even thought too much about it. I've just kind of walked away from this tank. I know it's in good condition. I did a big water change. I've left the air stone in there. So it's fine in those regards. I've been feeding the tank and staying on top of it. I just haven't been thinking about it too much because it just breaks my heart every time I think about it. That black ghost was one of my special fish. It's a fish I've had for a long time, like way back since the beginning. That's one of the reasons I was so reluctant to get rid of it, even though we never saw it. I've literally had that since way back. I bought it way sooner than I even should have, experience-wise. And I've just had that fish for a long time, and now it's gone. And it's gone due to my error, and it's something I really feel like I should have known better about. In fact, I did know better, and I just kind of thought, it'll be all right. And now my fish is dead. So, live and learn. I'm not beating myself up too bad about it. If you're going to get too upset about every mistake you make and fish you lose, you're in the wrong hobby, because it's going to happen. That's just part of this hobby. It's the worst part of this hobby, but it is definitely a part of this hobby. And so the important part is learning from those mistakes and not doing it again, and hopefully that will be the case. And of course, in my case, I always like to share those mistakes so that maybe somebody else can avoid making them as well. So positive note on this tank, I will say I threw some live bears in here. just to try to get on top of the hair algae that was growing out of control. I also reduced the lighting by half. I only have one fixture lit, which does not really work in this tank. It's a very deep tank. It's 18 inches deep. So one tube down the middle like that really just lights up the middle of the tank, and it just doesn't really work. Any fish swims near the front, those are my rainbow fish, and all you see is, silhouette and like a translate. You're seeing through them rather than the fantastic colors that are on them, and that's because the light is further back in the tank than they are. It's way further back in the tank than they are by many inches. So I really need to get the lighting back up to snuff on this tank, but I'm trying to work that algae back, and I think the reduced lighting is certainly helping. I'm not so sure my plants are too happy about it. They're looking a little spindly over here, but the algae is starting to go away a little bit. And you can see how even where the algae still is, it's being shorn back. It looks like it's being cropped or trimmed. And that is because I've got all these little guppies and little Endler hybrids in there, and they are making a dent in it. So I'm probably going to wind up throwing a few of the neon swordtails. I've got a couple of them in my wife's tank upstairs where the one bred, and I've also got a bunch more guppies in my office tank. Another one dropped a bunch of babies in there, so I can just scoop a bunch of random babies out and throw them in this tank, and the ones that survive will go on to eat a lot of that algae, and maybe we'll be able to finally get it back under control in this tank. So those are all thoughts and options on this tank, but at some point in the near future, I'm really going to need to get over here excuse me, and get this tank back together and get the lighting back on it and do something more permanent, get that air stone out of there, etc. So look forward to that. It'll be coming up soon enough. My 125 gallon native tank, not a lot to speak of in here. I did add some Anubias, big clump right there, seems to be doing pretty well. And I added a big clump down there, which seems to be doing pretty well. The fish are doing very well. They're just getting enormous in here. I kind of smile to myself every time I go fishing up the street now. I know I'm only going up there to catch little creek chubs and little tiny, sunfish, cracker-sized sunfish that, aren't even big enough to count as bait. But it's still fun. I like doing it. But every time I catch one of those little creek chubs, I always think about these, especially chubs here, my big one, and I don't catch anything close to this size in the stream up the street. Now, when I go to the larger stream that I like to fish at, George's Creek, that's about a 5-mile drive from here. That's not as simple as walking across the street. But when I walk up on George's Creek, there's a little pool right there, and it's got all these big fish that are about a foot long and about as big around as my forearm, it looks like. They're probably not, but that's the way it seems. And I've never been able to catch them. They always just lie on the bottom. I've never really known what they were. But now that I'm looking at chubs here, and I know that these creek chubs can get a foot, I think that's what they are. So I might try to catch some of them at some point, not to bring back home to put in this tank. This is just sort of a just a thought while I'm looking at them for a few moments here, but I might try to catch one of them to see if I can actually outdo the creek chubs that I have here in my tank, because every time I go fishing in the stream and catch them, I don't catch anything close to the size that I've got here in my tank. So it's always fun going out, but I could probably catch bigger fish by throwing a line in here. I actually considered doing that today. I've got my little jig head and my little fake grub on there, and I'm catching creek chubs much smaller than this, and I guarantee if I dropped that little grub in there, it would not even hit the bottom, and I would snag one of those creek chubs. And I really thought about doing that just because I thought it would be silly and fun, but then I thought it would probably also upset some people to see me hook one of my fish, in my fish tank and catch it. But I don't know. We'll see. Maybe I'll do that one day if we're trying to thin the herd a little bit. Maybe that's how I'll do it. I'll just see if I can catch some of the larger ones and remove them that way, and we'll take them back out and put them out in the stream. I don't know. Just a thought. Something to consider. Snail tank is still just my snail tank. I really need to get in there and do something about I don't know, it's about an inch deep now, all that mulm and everything, but that's also full of snails rummaging through it and crawling around and breeding. So again, I don't know. Who cares? It's just a snail tank. They just breed in there no matter what. So my 40-gallon gudgeon tank, I had to think about what tank we were looking at for a minute because it looks so different, is finally nice and brightly lit like it always should have been. I had that really terrible homemade LED panel on there for a long time, and I'm finally glad that I got rid of that. It's probably a little too bright at this point, both for the plants that are in there. It's just going to grow like crazy. And of course the gudgeon that's in here is not a big fan of a brightly lit tank. And then that little South American bumblebee catfish, if that's even still alive, and I honestly don't know if it is. It's been a long time since I've seen it. There have been times in the past where I've gone months without seeing it, and it's turned up again. And if we look back there, you can kind of see that crack in the rock is still there. And I tend to think if that catfish was not living down there, that crack would have probably been covered over by sand from the gudgeon kicking around. And I do still have my rubber lip pleco, usually down here somewhere. I don't know, maybe we're looking at its silhouette right now. I'm kind of bending down at a funny angle. I think that's him right there. I think that's its silhouette. So that's the rubber lip pleco is still in there. And I don't see the gudgeon. He's in there somewhere. But he usually hides down in the vegetation to stay out of the light. And I just don't see him anywhere. When I come in here and start feeding, he'll drift up all of a sudden. He'll just be there and waiting for his shrimp, and there he'll be. So again, not a lot to talk about. I did do a big chemi-clean treatment on this tank. It worked wonders. Everything in here looks fantastic. I'm probably going to have to do it again in the future. I'm sure the stuff will grow back to some degree. In fact, I'm looking at right now, we can see that little bit of green growing in there. I might reach in there when I'm done this video, if I think about it, and just snag that out of there. Just, you know, the less that's in there physically to start growing, the more it'll slow it down. But it's probably going to come back at some point, and we'll have to do the treatment again. It's just, you know, it's like mowing the lawn. It's not a one-time deal. You got to keep doing it because it grows back. And in the meantime, it looks fantastic. So I'm really happy with the way this tank looks, but not a lot to talk about in it. So moving on to my 125 here. I did a big water change on this tank, and I found a dead Congo in it before I did the water change. That's why I did the water change, in fact. If you look in the very far end, you'll see my rainbow shark swimming around down there in the corner. So I lifted the lid to feed it the other night, and I got a whiff of dead fish, and I looked down, and right under my face was a dead Congo tetra. It was one of my originals from back in the day when I had them over in my 40 breeder, which is, you know, formerly my Black Ghost knifefish tank that started out as my African tank years ago. With my Tenopoma was the size of a postage stamp, and my Synodontis down here was about 1 inch long, and the Congo tetras were all little tiny fish. And now it's to the point where all the original Congo tetras are gone. I think all the original fish in that tank are now gone, except for my Tenopoma and my Synodontis catfish there. So there's my Tenopoma over there, lurking over. So those two are my odd couple. They always pal around and hang out together. They're two cool fish. I really like them a lot. But anyway, smelled the dead fish, got in there, did the water change. While I was in there, I wiped the glass down. And for those of you that remember, the last time I talked about this tank, it had all that really thick, weird green stuff growing on my fern up here. And whatever it was, I just vacked it out. I just gently rubbed it with my hands, and it just brushed away. It was like it was just stuck against it, like the current had, you know, drifted it up against it and stuck it to it. It seemed like it was not attached in any way. And that's it. That's all I did. I mean, you can see how clean and clear it looks. It doesn't even look like there's any growing on it anymore. It's, well, you can see some down in there, I guess. But compared to what it looked like before, this is a whole different ballgame. I mean, it just basically looks like the fern again. So I'm not sure what was going on there, but I cleared it out, and it looks a lot better. I also wiped the glass down and did a big filter change and got that all cleaned out. So the only other real changes I've made in this tank recently was the addition of the third loach. I did remove the loach from my gourami tank, and it's this one. I can tell because the bands, the dark bands across its back have sort of light spots on it, whereas the other two original ones are dark all the way across. So they think they're getting dinner, but they're not, at least not yet. So that gives you a size that's pretty close to the glass. So they're maybe 5 inches. The big one over there is maybe 6. So everything's still going well. I just don't know. I'm assuming when I lost that Congo, it was just age. Again, they don't live that long. I probably had that Congo for close to 6 years or something, and it was the last of the original batch. So, no great loss there. But it does sort of feel like the turning of a page, the end of an era. So I think when we start repopulating this tank again, we're going to focus on rainbow fish. I'm not going to go with this same species here. This is a hybrid species called Marcy rainbow fish, and I believe they came from Parkinson's or whatever they're called. I think that's one of the fish they were hybridized from. So I'm going to go with a non-hybridized, just a natural rainbow fish. I don't really like getting the gene pools too muddied up with all the weird fish you can get out there and all the, crazy creations that you get. So I'm just going to find some nice pretty rainbows, and we're going to restock this tank with a nice big school. And in another year or so, when they've grown out, we're going to have some really, really beautiful fish going on in this tank. So moving on to my 20-gallon angelfish tank. Just did a water change on this tank recently. I know the glass looks a little grungy. I did not bother to get in and do any wiping of the glass or anything. I've got some plecos in there that scrape it and crawl around. In fact, you can see one of my clown plecos sitting right there on the bottom. And then I've got 2 big mystery snails that crawl around in this tank. So while the glass isn't the cleanest, it's never dirty and filthy and hard to see through either. And this is one of those tanks, for whatever reason, that I generally just don't really pay that much attention to. It's just kind of a tank I set up one day, and there it is. It wasn't really ever deliberate. It just kind of happened. And so it's fine. I'm not really unhappy with it. And again, I did a water change, so everything is fine as far as the water quality. Not a lot to talk about there. My quarantine tank, and I'm almost reluctant to call it that anymore. I haven't used it as a quarantine tank in a while. The last fish I put in here was the 2 Bolivian rams. The one bullied the other one, and when I removed the dominant one, the other one died, and the tank is just grungy and gross, and I haven't done much in here. I've apparently got snails breeding in here. But I've also got 2 coolie loaches in here. I haven't seen them in a few days, but I have seen them not too long ago. They just bury themselves in the gravel all the time, but occasionally they'll come out and swim around. So one of these days, I'm going to get in here and get this tank cleaned up. I thought about maybe using this tank as doing a demonstration video of how to use the ChemiClean, because this is exactly the kind of grungy, gross crap that it gets cleaned up and destroys. And maybe we can even catch those little fish and get them out of there and just use the tank as a model to get it cleaned up, or maybe just leave the fish in there to demonstrate how you can do it without harming the fish. So I don't know, something to think about, but other than that, not much to talk about in that tank. So getting to Butterbean's tank here, let's get his additional light turned on. Hopefully this won't freak him out too much. So I just did a fairly sizable water change on this tank yesterday, or possibly the day before. They all run together for me now. And what I did for the first time since I've had Butterbean here was I did a water change with my regular siphon hose and just drained a bunch of water out of the tank. And then I refilled it with water directly from my tap. Now, remember, I've got treated water, I've got well water, I run it through a fairly elaborate treatment system. It's, I don't have to worry about ammonia and chlorine and all that kind of stuff that might be in, normal municipal water or something like that. I've got pure water going into these tanks. So I did not reduce it all the way to freshwater. I only did about a 50% water change. And with that 50% water change, I theoretically reduce the salinity by about 50%. So I don't know what it is. I actually should have gotten out my whatever that thing is called, my refractometer, and checked the specific gravity to see what it actually is now that I've done this water change. So the reason I'm doing it, I'm getting distracted by trying to watch where the butterbean's going and where the other fish. He keeps banging himself into the corner. I was wondering what he was doing. The reason I'm doing it is, if you can see that sort of lump of reddish stuff on the gravel back there, and you can see the reddish stuff that grows on here. I removed a fair amount of it when I did the water change, as I always do, but I want to see if reducing the salinity will actually change that. Now, at some point I'll have to bring the salinity back up, because ultimately butterbean and the little bumblebee gobies that you see in there occasionally, those little tiny black and yellow fish, they need to be in brackish water. And while the mollies do well in brackish water, they also will do well enough in almost brackish water. And I am going to do a video here in the next, probably tomorrow, about brackish water, and I'm just going to go over. I did one called Brackish Basics years ago, and I always just seem to think that once I've done a video about something, I don't ever have to worry about it again. But it's been a long time, so it's probably time for a refresher about what brackish water is and how brackish aquariums work, and we can talk about brackish water in the natural environment and so on and so forth. So with it being reduced, I'm no longer probably at a specific gravity that counts as brackish, but it's definitely not, like my other tanks. It's not freshwater in the sense that it's got a very low dissolved solids. There's still a lot of dissolved marine salts in that water, believe me. So it's not, again, it's not like my other tanks, but we'll save that for another video. But that's what I've got going on here in Butterbean's tank at the moment. And while I was in there, of course, I wiped down the glass and got that looking all nice and clear. And then when you turn that front light on, it makes it super bright like that. So we were going to talk about my waterfall tank, but we are almost half an hour in, and I think that is long enough for anybody to have to listen to me ramble on about my fish. So we will save that for a separate video, because I could probably do a half an hour on that tank by itself. So here we are back at my 29. We made it all the way around the world. So I'm going to say thanks for watching. Make sure you're subscribed. You don't want to miss anything coming up. Don't forget, this one is my 29-gallon miscellaneous. I'll see you real soon in the next one.